Welcome back. I'm now joined by the chairman of Maruti, R.C. Bhargav, the former Secretary General of FICCI, Rajiv Kumar, a former Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, Arvind Virmani, and the chairman of Oxus Investments, Surjit Bhalla. Dr. Kumar, this week, as I said in that introduction, there's speculation that the government could accommodate some of Congress's key concerns, thus making it possible for GST to pass in the winter session. Let's therefore look at Congress's key concerns one by one and ask A, how important they are, and B, how easily they can be accommodated. Now, first of all, Congress insists that the 1% interstate entry tax should be abolished because it could have a cascading effect on inflation, and also it undermines the very credibility of GST. Do you agree with Congress on this demand?
I agree with the Congress on this demand because I think in a situation where the central government can guarantee all compensation for any revenue loss, there is no reason for the state governments of manufacturing states like Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu and Gujarat to insist on this. And I think the Congress is right that this 1% additional tax on interstate transactions is against the very spirit of the GST. So I think this demand should be accommodated.
Mr. Bhargav, the states insisting on this 1% interstate entry tax are in fact what are called producing states, and essentially there are just three of them: Gujarat, Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu. But once the government has guaranteed 100% compensation for full 5 years, do these states still have grounds for demanding a 1% entry tax?
No, I think if the compensation is actually going to be 100% of what they were getting in the past.
And that Mr. Jaitley has guaranteed earlier on.
In that case, the 1% will only mean that the amount of compensation they get will be reduced by that 1%. So then the 1% makes no difference at all.
So then you are in agreement with Congress to scrap this?
It neutralizes what you get here, you lose here.
So you agree with Congress's position?
No.
Is that a yes?
Yes.
Mr. Virmani, Mr. Jaitley, speaking at ASSOCHAM just a couple of days ago, described Congress's demands as preposterous, talking specifically and only at this moment of time about that 1% interstate entry tax. Is that in your eyes a preposterous demand or an acceptable and justified one?
Well, he was talking about three demands. This one is certainly not, but the other two are.
I'll come to the other two later. I'll come to the other two later. Let's take this one by one for audiences who aren't as familiar as you are. Stick for now to the 1% interstate entry tax. Is it correct to describe this as preposterous?
Well, you're giving me a loaded question. The fact is that no economist that who knows anything about taxation would have recommended the 1% tax. It's really a compromise with the states which were opposing for 10 years. Among them were the producing states, and it was a compromise because earlier the compensation was 50%, then it was raised, etc. At this point, there is absolutely no need to have this 1%, even as a compromise.
So then, here are you saying, if one forgets about the history which explains why this original clause was inserted, now that there's 100% compensation for full 5 years, are you saying at this point, this 1% entry tax should be scrapped?
Absolutely, because as the other two have said, there is really nothing to kind of discuss on this matter among people who know anything about taxation.
Surjit Bhalla, of the three principal producing states who want this 1% entry tax, two, Gujarat and Maharashtra, are BJP ruled. The third, AIADMK, is clearly not. Now, would you agree that if Mr. Modi and Mr. Jaitley can bring Maharashtra and Gujarat online, because after all, they rule them, then with Congress supporting the measure, Tamil Nadu's opposition won't matter any longer?
Yeah, and look, this was a, if you will, a preposterous suggestion to have this 1% tax. I don't think it matters whether you get Gujarat and Maharashtra on your side and AIADMK comes around. is basically an agreement with the Congress, and I think the BJP has to and must agree, because it's a very, very sensible decision to scrap this 1%. It should not have been there in the first place.
You put it very strongly. The suggestion for the 1% entry tax was preposterous, and you said the BJP has to and must agree to scrap it. You're putting it very strongly, aren't you?
Yeah, but you know, this is the simplest one, and I think my own reading is, I think it was put in there as a negotiating tactic by the BJP. So now when push comes to shove, they say, listen, we're doing away with the 1%.
All right, let's then come to the other two Congress demands, which are clearly more difficult to handle and perhaps not so easy to accept. Rajiv Kumar, the second Congress concern is that the GST rate should be capped at 18%. In one of his blogs, I think it was the 2nd of August this year, but I can't swear to the date, Arun Jaitley actually said there is some rationale to the demand to cap the rate. Do you agree that it should be capped?
On theoretical grounds, Karan, a specific rate should not be hardwired into the law, into the legislation, because it becomes very difficult in future to change that should the need arise. But from where I can see, 18% is a high enough rate for indirect taxation in India. Our largest competitor, China, has, I think, a cap rate of maximum rate of 17% indirect tax in that country. So any higher rate than that would mean that we make our industry and our producers less competitive. So I don't mind this as a pragmatic, practical compromise, that if the Congress wants this 18% to be hardwired into the law, so be it, because in future they would face the music as well if they come to rule, in the government, and this rate needs to be changed. So I think I would go along with this demand for putting a cap of 18%, which I repeat is high enough for the GST rate in the country.
Now, Mr. Bhargav, unconfirmed reports, but there are fairly numerous numbers of them in the newspapers nonetheless, say that whilst the government could agree to a cap, it might not agree to 18%. Some reports suggest it might prefer 20. There are even a few reports that say it could settle for something like 22 or 23. How do you respond to that range of caps? Not 18, but possibly all the way to 22, 23.
Personally, I agree with what Rajiv said, that I don't like the idea of a cap being put into the law relating to any tax, because that takes away the flexibility of adjusting rates in future. And whether it's 18 or 19 or 20, there's no way of knowing actually which is the right rate, because what you really want is that with the GST, there should be as close to revenue neutrality as possible. And whether 18 will give that, or 19 will give that, or 17 will give that, I don't think anybody quite knows accurately what it will be.
So are you saying, in fact, given your arguments, there shouldn't be a cap?
I'm saying there shouldn't be a cap.
There shouldn't be a cap.
No.
In other words, what the rate is should be left completely open-ended.
That's right.
Mr. Virmani, Congress is insisting that the cap must be written into the actual constitutional amendment. For his part, Mr. Jaitley says that this would be impractical and it would create enormous difficulties, because if in exigencies the cap had to be raised, you would actually have to go through an entire constitutional amendment to do so, which would make it either very difficult, if not outrightly impossible. How do you respond to Mr. Jaitley's argument?
See, this is a very important question. I am not aware of any constitution in the world which puts tax rates and tax procedures into the constitution. And prima facie, it sounds completely absurd to me. I'm sorry to say it very strongly, because the whole constitutional amendment is taking certain domestic indirect taxes which are in the central list, and certain domestic indirect taxes, virtually all of them, which are in the state list, and combining them into a single GST or a single tax, call it GST or whatever. And presumably that will be in the concurrent list. That doesn't matter. I don't think this is a constitutional matter. I find it quite absurd, actually, Where it can go is in the GST bill. You know, there will be a bill on the GST itself, and if there is a strong consensus among everybody that there should be a cap of whatever 18 or 20%, it can be put into the GST bill. But to have it in the Constitution, it just sends a signal that what is this Constitution? I mean, if you're going to put trivial things like tax rates into the Constitution, I mean, what do you have any respect for the Constitution? I don't know.
Sujit Bhalla, I want to pick up on the suggestion you heard from Dr. Virmani, because actually that was going to be precisely my question to you. If it is not right and proper for a tax cap to be actually part of the Constitution, what about Dr. Virmani's idea of putting it into the GST bill, which is not part of the Constitution? That's something that is legislated for by Parliament. And what you could do is to so word it that the GST rate will not be more than X. And each year, different governments, central and state, in their budgets could define what X would be for that year. Do you think that is a better way of A, having a cap, but B, avoiding the constitutional trap?
Yeah, first I want to fully endorse what Arvind is saying. If you were looking for something preposterous, absurd, ridiculous, it is the Congress suggestion that the 18% or whatever the rate be in the Constitution. And it is an insult to a Constitution to have something like this as one of the constituents of the Constitution. So let us be very clear. This is, you know, in the range of absurd suggestions that have been made by responsible political parties. This one is out of the ballpark. So now we come to the more important question. I don't even think it should be in the bill. Every year or whatever, there should be an understanding, or not an understanding, there will be an explicit number as to what the rate is. And when the rate has to be raised or lowered, there can be a debate, or the Ministry of Finance comes out with a budget, they come out with this recommendation.
You said every year there should be an understanding. You even use the word explicit understanding of what the rate should be.
No, no.
How do you reach that understanding if you don't have a cap?
Every year. No. That's what I'm saying. Once you agree on this constitutional amendment which allows taxation all to be aggregated together, then you also agree on a rate, and I would presume and think that they would decide on a rate that stands the test of time, that they don't have to come in and change everything.
Should that rate be part of the GST bill?
Tax rates,
should that rate be part of the GST bill, as Dr. Virmani suggested? Because that's different to the Constitution. Part of the bill passed by Parliament, which can be then easily changed each year.
What should be in the Constitution is that there's an aggregation, there's a value-added tax, all the rest of it.
What about the GST bill?
That should be in the Constitution. After that, now I'm coming to that. Just like you have a finance bill every year, which the Parliament votes on, I would hope that this rate that you decide on is for 1 year, for several years, and that only under extreme circumstances does the Parliament get together and decide whether to change it or not.
So it's part of the GST bill, as Dr. Virmani says. You're agreeing with Dr. Virmani.
First bill. Sorry?
So you're agreeing with Dr.
Yes,
Virmani. Make it part of the GST bill.
And I'm not enough of a constitutional or finance expert whether it should be even part of the GST bill, but presumably if it is needed, then put it there, not in the constitutional amendment.
Let me go back to Dr. Virmani for clarification. Dr. Virmani, is there, as far as you know, any likely parliamentary problem or constitutional problem in putting a GST cap into the GST bill? Or is that something that can easily be done?
No,
just like the finance bill announces the taxes for a year, you can have a GST bill every year announcing the GST rate for that year.
So as far as I know, there is no problem. One could easily have, I mean, just as an example, in the GST bill saying that the total GST tax, whatever you define, however you define it, will not exceed 20%. And let's say we find 3 years from now that it should really have been 19% or 21%. 3 years later, we can change that GST bill.
Absolutely. A GST bill is easy to change. a constitutional amendment is much more difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. All right, let's then come, Mr. Rajiv Kumar, forgive me, Dr. Rajiv Kumar.
For a minute.
Sorry? Yes, go ahead. I'm coming to you, but go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to I wanted to say that while I agree with both Arvind and Surjit that the constitution is not the place to have it, for me to call in some sense the Congress party's bluff at the moment is important, because otherwise the GST, which is a critical bill and a huge advance in getting a unified national market, etc., will still hang for another year or so, and they will get an excuse to not let it pass. And if needed afterwards, you can amend the constitution and take it out.
Okay.
But the call for the moment is to somehow get the GST bill through.
In other words, tactically or strategically to call Congress's bluff, agree to put it in the constitution as an interim measure which you can change later, although changing later is not easy because it's a constitutional amendment, but at least you'll get GST underway. No, but I want to move on. I don't want to get stuck on this issue because there are others that I want to come, so I'm going to move on. I'm going to come to you first on what I call the third big Congress demand, which is with regard to a dispute resolution mechanism. At the moment, the GST, as envisaged by Mr. Jaitley, says that all disputes between the states themselves or the states and the centre will be resolved by the Council of States. Congress says, no, we need a separate independent mechanism. Who's right in this instance?
No, I can't see how and what this independent mechanism will be, which will take decisions which will bind the state governments, because the state governments in terms of their taxation powers are sovereign, and giving that taxation power to a third party, maybe judiciary or somebody, is clearly not going to be acceptable to any of the states. And you can't have a system which the states don't like, because ultimately it's not the Congress party or any other party which is going to implement GST. It's going to be the state governments.
So your answer is, if there are disputes between the states or between the states and the centre, the Council of States has to resolve it, not an independent mechanism.
Absolutely.
So here you disagree with Congress.
Absolutely.
Mr. Virmani, I want to pursue with you one of the arguments Arun Jaitley has made against the idea of an independent judicial mechanism to handle disputes. You've heard it echoed a moment ago by Mr. Bhargav. I'll put it more elaborately to you. Mr. Jaitley says that tax is perhaps the only surviving area where Parliament has sole prerogative. If the dispute mechanism that the Congress is suggesting involves a judicial authority, then what you're doing is hand to that judicial authority the ultimate power to decide what tax should be, and that is further to reduce the prerogative of Parliament and hand it over to the judiciary via a judicial mechanism. And this would be undermining Parliament's prerogative to set taxation, or the legislature's prerogative. Do you agree with that argument, that this is a backdoor way of handing a tax matter to a judicial authority?
Yeah, I think the weight of arguments, though I'm open to kind of learning more about it, but as you have put it, I would tend to support that argument. But let me just quickly add one more point here. You know, we've been discussing dispute mechanisms and how these rates will be set again for 10 years. So the majority of the states have accepted whatever is the proposed mechanism as of today. Now, is the Congress party reopening that whole issue again? I think we must think that we have taken a long time, 5-10 years, and the states have agreed because they have to approve the constitutional amendment. They have agreed to whatever that mechanism is for setting rates, etc. Why don't we stick to it? Is there something fundamentally flawed with it? Then Congress should make suggestions. I think if they are reasonable suggestions, they can be accepted.
Sujit Bhalla, a second argument Mr. Jaitley advances for rejecting the Congress claim that we need an independent judicial mechanism, and for insisting that in fact the Council of States themselves will sort out the problem, is that in fact the problems when they occur will be political, not economics. And therefore the problems need to be resolved by politicians, which means the Council of States. Congress's riposte to that is that the disputants can't be judges in their own case. On this argument, who are you with, Jaitley or Congress?
Well, this is another example of a preposterous demand by the Congress, and if proof were needed, that basically that the Congress was playing delaying tactics and suggesting to the nation that, listen, they're doing it in the interest of the nation when all they're doing it is in the interest of the political party to stop a major legislation from going through. So I'm not at all on the side of the Congress. I mean, it just does not make any sense. Why is the bluff not being called? Why aren't the analysts, etc., saying this is a preposterous demand by the Congress? The Council of States, Arvind has rightly said, and it's been going on for 10 years, everybody has agreed. Now these guys come up with a new dispute resolution. I mean, what's going on?
Okay, just clearly you're not with Congress on this one. Dr. Rajiv Kumar, let me put it like this.
Yeah.
When the retrospective taxation issue in the Vodafone case came up, it went to the Bombay High Court, it went to the Supreme Court. After the Supreme Court ruled, it went back to the Supreme Court in a review petition. So at least at 3 critical stages, the courts were involved. And in that case, absolutely no one said that the judiciary was intervening and trespassing on Parliament's prerogative to settle matters of taxation. So in this instance of GST, does it really matter if there are disputes between states or between the states together and the centre over what the rate should be, if that dispute gets resolved by a judicial authority?
Now, I think it does matter, because in this case, what is being suggested is that the judicial authority, whatever it is, be the first recourse to take in case of dispute. While in the other cases that you just cited, these were recourse to review at different levels. So I cannot see, as you said yourself earlier, the legislature handing over its functions and powers in our democratic system, where there is a division of power, to the judiciary. I dare say, if there is a settlement which some states don't like in future, which is done by the Council of States, they will go to the Supreme Court, because they will take it as a constitutional matter, and that is always open. But why should the Congress want this as a first step is not clear to me.
All right.
I thought what was happening is that there would be a Council of Finance Ministers headed by the Central Finance Minister to look into all these disputes. So it's not a matter of disputants being the judges themselves, because not all states will be the disputants. It will be a dispute normally between 2 states or between 1 state and the center, in which case this Council of Finance Ministers headed by the Central Finance Minister would suffice.
Okay.
And then it can be appealed for review in any judicial court as you like.
Let me try and sum up what we've achieved so far, Mr. Bhargav, with you. On the 1% interstate entry tax, absolutely everyone believes Congress is right. The government should scrap it. It shouldn't continue. On the question of dispute resolution, practically no one seems to agree with Congress. And on that other issue of a cap, at least one of my guests, Mr. Rajiv Kumar, said, call Congress's bluff. GST is too important to hold it up. Put it in the Constitution. Another one of my guests, Dr. Virmani, in a sense, not fully, but partly supported by Surjit Bhalla, said a cap should perhaps be put in the GST bill, not into the Constitution, because the bill can be changed. Now, the question I want to put to you is this. When Congress's demands were first raised, and we're going back several months in time, in his blog of the 2nd of August, Mr. Jaitley dismissed them by saying these were issues that weren't brought up by Pranab Mukherjee, they weren't brought up by P. Chidambaram, and therefore he concluded Congress was raising them as afterthoughts and as obstacles. Now you found support for one, half support for another, opposition to the third. Do you think Mr. Jaitley's original dismissive answer was impolitic, that he should have been more accommodating at that stage rather than dismissive?
You know, how politicians go about their business of negotiations and settling disputes is something which I am no expert to comment on. But one comment I'd like to make, even this 1% which we all agree upon, to my mind is actually a non-issue. Because whether that 1% is given here and reduced from the compensation for 5 years, or it's given as part of the 5-year compensation, actually means that the whole scheme is really immaterial.
But that means that Mr. Jaitley could agree to Congress's demand on the 1% without losing anything.
Probably
it's not worth his while making it a sticking point.
He may have kept it as a negotiating point, that when we settle something, we'll give something, take something.
What about my earlier question? that given that there is a certain measure of support for some of Congress's demands, but not all, should Mr. Jaitley in August itself have been more accommodating rather than to be dismissive and suggest Congress is just raising this as obstructions?
As I said, Karan, how one should settle these disputes between two parties who have a very strong antipathy, it looks to me at the moment, is something which the leaders on both sides work out, because it may not be seen that you are too weak, it may not be seen you're too argumentative.
You're being diplomatic, which in fact the politicians themselves weren't. Maybe they should have learnt a lesson from you and used your diplomacy, and that would have broken the logjam. Let's take a break at that point, gentlemen, and then come back and ask, if none of Congress's recommendations and suggestions are taken on board, and if GST happens exactly as the government has presently structured it, how effective would it be? Or could it turn out to be A, disappointing, and B, not even fully implementable? And we're discussing GST, which now looks, after a certain measure of compromise seeming possible between Congress and the BJP, that it could happen, or at least the prospects suddenly look bright. Gentlemen, let's ask the question, what sort of GST would we have if none of Congress's concerns are taken on board and the structure as devised by Mr. Jaitley is what actually gets passed and legislated? First, you, Mr. Virmani. In a report released in September, Goldman Sachs said that the Modi government's model for GST may not significantly push up growth. It said that if tobacco, electricity and alcohol are excluded, and at the moment they are excluded, and if the 1% interstate entry tax is retained, and at the moment it's still there, then GST will only add 0.5% to GDP, not the 1.5% that politicians are claiming it will add. How do you respond to the Goldman Sachs report and this belief that the present structure of GST will only deliver 0.5%, not 1.5% GDP growth?
So, first thing, let me say, both tobacco and much of, for example, petrol, etc., much of these are final